everybody, welcome back to my channel. It's Gio, and today I want to talk to you guys about one of the rumored rosters for the Call of Duty League next year in 2020. I am making this video in collaboration with my friend Cam Allen, who is a Call of Duty statistician, and he has put together a load of stats that we can use in this video so that we can actually go through the players and have a look in quite some depth about all sorts of things about them and what we might expect from this supposed roster next year. So the roster we've decided to look at is Atlanta, and the reason that we've chosen to look at this roster is because looking at all the rumors that are going around, it seems to be the one that sort of has the most confidence about who is going to be on this roster. Intel Call of Duty has reported on it a number of times and seems to be really faithful that this is the roster that is going to be. Of course, it could all be wrong. All of these players could be different and it could all be a ruse, but we're going to take a look at it anyway. So first of all, let's talk about who is meant to be on this roster. We have got Simp, Abizi, Major Maniac, Priester, and Sullium. So you may straight away be thinking this is a really interesting bunch of players. We're going to have a look at all of them in a little bit more depth. So first of all, let's start off with Simp and Abizi. Now, these two we are fully expecting to be the SMG duo for this roster. They have come together as a duo from E United, so they have that pre-existing synergy, and they of course just won champs. So a very, very good team with this really strong SMG duo. Now, these are relatively fresh talent who will be coming into this. This was Simp's first year as a pro. Lots of people knew who he was for a little while, ever since Black Ops 3 really, but he was always too young. So he's finally over the age of 18, able to play pro this year. And Abizi was only really around in the competitive scene since World War II last year. He kind of made his name at CWL Birmingham and then came top 24 with Enigma 6 at Champs last year. So this is a really fresh duo. They've obviously done very, very well this year, but one of the great things about young, fresh talent is the fact that they're oftentimes malleable, easier to coach. There's a lot more in front of them. They're not kind of stuck in their ways. So that's a really great attribute for this duo. Now, when we have a look at their stats over the course of the Pro League, this is what we find. So for Simp, on his respawn maps, we have split this up between respawn and S&D because obviously they're quite different map types. But on his respawn maps, he has a 1.19 KD, 438 damage per minute, 4.27 elims per minute, and 19.92% team deaths, and that's over the course of 54 maps. And for his S&D, we have 1.36 KD and 180 damage per round, and that's over the course of 22 maps. And I also really wanted to throw in there that we should mention his 1.82 KD from CWL London on S&D, because there was absolutely mind-blowing and insane stat, and it is just the first stat in everything we're going to talk about today that kind of go to show that this team really are made of S&D stars. Now, when we look at Abizi, starting with his respawn, we have a 1.06 KD with a 431 DPM, a 4.69 EPM, and 21.15% team deaths, and that's over 60 maps. And then for S&D, we have 1.17 KD, 171 DPR, and that is over 31 maps. Now, you might think there's a little bit of a disparity in the stats between these two players, but they work so well. They have a really great synergy together because they each kind of take a slightly separate role within that duo. Of course, Abizi, he tends to play as the entry fragger, so he's more likely to get downed a lot more. In fact, when we look at their FBFD stat, which is first blood to first death, we have Abizi at 42 to 39 and Simp at 20 to 12. So over twice as much as Simp does Abizi get the first blood. So that just kind of goes to show that there is a slight role disparity between these two players. Simp also has a slightly different role in that he has a little bit of flexibility. We often see him on the Paladin in Black Ops 4. We've seen some really clutch plays from him. And one thing that we've heard from him himself, as well as other players that he really brought to this team, was learning how to play their life very well. He said that in an interview with Maven on Trading Shots, and we can also just see it in his play very frequently. He's the last one standing in a lot of team fights or in S&D rounds, and it just goes to show these two players have something slightly different to offer, but a very, very strong duo. Now, if we compare their stats to players from the same role, so other SMG players from the top 5 Pro League teams, we can see kind of how they match up to their counterparts. So on Respawn, Simp, he has the highest KD, he has the second highest DPM, a little bit low with the EPM, and then we look at S&D, he is the second highest KD and the second highest DPR. And then Abizi with Respawn, he is a little bit lower on the KD and DPM, sitting at 4th for both, but then he's first on EPM, so he's actually getting quite a lot of eliminations. And then when you look at S&D, he's kind of in that middle ground again at 4th and 5th for KD and DPR respectively. So these two are looking pretty strong. They're a very desirable duo, and it is entirely likely that going into Modern Warfare they will be kept as a duo, because there is a little bit point of contention with that as we move on to looking at who we assume will be our flex AR players, because we have Priester on the lineup who has been playing SMG all year. Now, Priester and Major Maniac are who we are assuming are going to be taking on those flex roles. It's going to be very interesting for Priester because he has a history in that flex AR role. We have seen him, especially towards the end of World War II, play a lot of that, and that was a much slower game, which is kind of how we're expecting Modern Warfare to be. So it could be that that playstyle suits him much better. But when FaZe were having a little bit of an issue at the Pro League qualifiers at the beginning of this year, a lot of people suspected that it may be because Priester was playing on the flex role. He was playing with a Maddox instead of on an SMG. And then when he ended up on 100 Thieves, they put him in the SMG role. So there are sort of ups and downs here where it's a bit like, well, how's Priester gonna handle this role? Is he gonna do well like he did in World War II? Or has he been playing SMG too long now? Did it work out too well for him in Black Ops 4? Were those issues really from the fact that he was playing flex? Because the thing is, with Modern Warfare, we suspect it to be a slower game where you're not really gonna need so much SMG power. You're definitely really not going to need 3, except maybe in certain situations like we saw in Black Ops 4. And it's so unlikely that they're going to split up the E-United duo, so that sort of means that Priester would be in this situation. Now, Major Maniac, he's going to be coming over from Gen G, who he's been with all year, and he hasn't actually played with Priester in the past, but with the constant switching of Spacely and Nagafen on the Gen G roster, Major Maniac's going to actually be pretty used to learning to synergize with a new player quite on the fly. So I would expect him to be fairly good at accommodating towards Priester if they are put together as this duo. Now, when we look at the stats for these two players, starting with Major Maniac on Respawn, we have a 1.02 KD, a 396 DPM, 4.39 EPM, and 19.61% team death. And then for S&D, we have a 1.11 KD and a 159 DPR. And then moving on to Priester, on Respawn, we have a 1.14 KD, a 418 DPM, 4.64 EPM, 20.87% team death. And then for S&D, 1.11 KD and 168 DPR. Now, one thing that's really important to bear in mind about Priester's stats is because he's been playing SMG all year, it does mean that his stats are going to be more reminiscent of what an SMG player may get. In fact, when you compare them to what Abizi has for his stats, you actually see they're fairly similar, and he and Abizi both played that grapple sword role. So it's not necessarily quite as reflective of what we might see if Priester had been playing Maddox or Flex AR rather all year. Now, they're both very aggressive players, and again, that's kind of partly because Priester has been on that SMG, but Major Maniac has been on Gen G. They're a very aggressive team led by Havoc and Envoy, who are two of the most aggressive SMGs in the game, at least over the last year. So again, it sort of comes back to that question of the slower game of Modern Warfare. Is it really going to suit that? So let's actually have a look to see how they compare to other players of this role. And again, bear in mind that Priester, we're comparing him to players who didn't play the same role as him last year. So Major Maniac, he doesn't have the most impressive respawn stats when you compare him to his counterparts. He has the 3rd team death percent, which is fairly good when you're thinking about playing your life or just surviving out the game. But other than that, he's joint 5th for KD, and DPM and EPM are 7th and 8th respectively. But then when you look at S&D, it's a little bit better. He's joint 2nd for KD and then 7th for DPR. So again, that's a little bit lower. And then Priester, again, he is 4th for KD, joint 4th for DPM, joint 2nd for EPM, and then 9th on the team death percentage. But then for S&D, he's joint 2nd for KD and joint 3rd for DPR. So S&D looking really good. But of course, there are a lot of questions about this duo if that's what they end up being because of some of the points that we mentioned earlier. So let's move on to Salyum. Now, Salyum's a really interesting player, and he is who we're going to be assuming will be taking on that main AR role. Now, this is going to be interesting because Salyum is one of the most flexible players all over the 2019 Pro League. We saw him on SMG, we saw him on the Maddox, and we saw him on the ICR. So he has taken every single role that you can possibly have really in Black Ops 4, and as we come to this game, we're potentially expecting him to have to narrow down a little bit more to that main AR role without flexing much beyond that, because we already have flexible players at the SMG flex end of the spectrum. Now, one really good thing about Salyum is that he has a really solid grasp of the differences between the roles. Sometimes when you see players have to flex onto a different role, you see kind of playstyles bleed into roles from one that they're a little bit more used to. But actually, if you compare a lot of the playstyles of Salyum across those different gun types, you see the way he plays an SMG or the way he plays a Maddox is very different to how he plays an ICR, as it should be. So that does at least give me some hope that if he does have to kind of stick in the box of main ACR, he's going to really solidly understand that and not necessarily be bleeding out into a more aggressive flex or SMG playstyle. He's actually a very meticulous AR, and if you go and watch some VODs of him playing, you'll see he's very good at holding angles. He's not tempted to go and you know, make some hero play or run around, be aggressive. He's very, very disciplined. And just to add to the point about his flexibility, something very interesting about him is on maps in Black Ops 4 where you typically would see 3 SMGs be run, so for example on a frequency hardpoint, it was actually oftentimes Salyum who would take that 3rd SMG rather than one of the other players on the team, like Scraps or Zero. Oftentimes it's very rare that you would kind of see the guy who generally plays the ICR be the one to go and take that SMG. So it is very interesting. He is a very unique player, and if anything, this means that this team would have a lot of flexibility, but it also means that his stats are a little bit skewed because of how many different roles he has played. So let's take a look at them. For Respawn, he's sitting there at a 1.13 KD, 418 DPM, 4.36 EPM, and a 20.38% team death. And then for Search and Destroy, we have a 1.4 KD and 217 DPR. Now, if we have a look and compare that to the other players, he's sat at 2nd in Respawn for KD, 4th for DPM, 1st for EPM, and 5th for the team death percentage. But then for S&D, he's sitting at 1st for both KD and DPR. He is such a strong S&D player. And again, these are all map types where we have seen him play all those different roles. Another interesting thing about Salyum is the fact that he played with Priester in the Vegas Open and the Pro League qualifiers. They were both on the same team at that time. FaZe didn't necessarily do all that great back then, but both the teams, 100 Thieves, which Priester then went on to, and FaZe, which Salyum stayed in, did go on to actually perform really well throughout the rest of the season. So Priester and Salyum coming back together could be a really interesting thing to see, because they'll have old synergy, they're old friends, but they've both been able to improve over the course of the season. Now, of course, that could necessarily bring back some bad habits, but I think it's probably mostly going to be a positive thing. So it actually looks like a great roster made of strong players, but there are a few questions about this roster, and the main one is going to be, will it work for Modern Warfare? We mentioned it a couple of times, but this roster is made of these S&D stars who love playing SMGs and being very aggressive, and everyone's kind of predicting Modern Warfare to be a little bit slower, a little bit more similar to World War II, a little bit more ICR heavy. If you've been playing the beta so far, I haven't been because I'm a PC player and I don't have access yet. But if you've been playing the beta so far, then you'll probably know that the ARs are actually very, very strong. Cam, who provided all the stats for this video, has been saying to me he loves playing SMG and he's been having a really hard time. So the question really is how much is this roster that leans way more towards the SMG and flex roles going to really fare in a game that seems so main AR heavy and so much slower? Because while in general you have people who can cover all of those roles, there's of course the question about whether Priest is going to be a good enough flex, because he's been out of the flex loop and he did very well on SMG this year. There are the questions about, is Sullium going to be a good enough main AR, because he's going to be really expected to stick to that role. And generally we expect that if people have to flex the off role, they're probably going to be moving more towards the main AR end of the spectrum than the SMG end of the spectrum. And is there the kind of role pool, the skill pool in this team to allow for a really competitive group of players where there's more than one main AR and then moving away from that SMG end of that spectrum? And that's the interesting thing, because I mean, we look at Major Maniac as someone who you may think, okay, well, he'll take on the second main AR role, but Major Maniac throughout this past year was not the member of his team, Gen G, who would take on that second AR role. That was usually Nagafen. So for him, that would be relatively big learning curve. He would be really going out of his comfort zone and something he's not really been doing all of that much. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to keep an eye on. Obviously, we don't really know anything about who's going to be coaching this team or anything like that. Because we don't even know if this roster is true. It's all rumored right now, so there could be some information that is missing that would give us a little bit more intel. We don't know who any subs would be, anything like that. We just know that people are fairly confident that this is the roster for CoD Atlanta. I'm really interested to know what you guys think, because this is a group of very strong players, but there are of course those question marks regarding roles, regarding whether it suits Modern Warfare and things like that. And I think regardless of what's going to happen, this is going to be a team that's going to have to go through a little bit of a learning curve and you know, some synergizing of course before they can actually stand up to the plate how they have been throughout Black Ops 4. So yeah, let us know what your predictions are, what you think about this team, who you think could maybe be swapped in or out to make it a little bit better, where you think maybe there's any weak spots, any particular strong points. I'm really interested to know. But I hope you found this video interesting. I just wanted to provide some interesting stats about these players and some interesting information, and hopefully as some more info comes out on other teams, we'll be able to do more. I know that I'm really excited to find out more about the London team. But thank you so much for watching. I've been Geo, Cam has been Cam, and I will see you in the next video. Bye guys.